This photograph you are seeing now might appear to be merely another routine prison mugshot from 1891. A man seated in the standard chair used for documenting inmates at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, his dark eyes staring directly into the camera lens, with the resigned expression typical of those who had accepted their fate within the prison system. His name was recorded as Thomas Whitmore, prisoner number 1481, convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to death by hanging. But if you look more closely, if you truly observe the details that most people prefer to ignore, you will begin to perceive something profoundly disturbing about this seemingly ordinary documentation photograph. The unusual intensity in the subject's gaze, the way shadows seem to bend around his figure in defiance of the studio lighting, the strange quality of stillness that suggests not resignation, but patient waiting for something yet to come. This is not simply the portrait of a condemned man awaiting execution. This is the final photographic record of Thomas Whitmore before he was hanged on December 15th, 1891, and the beginning of a mystery that would challenge everything the prison staff thought they understood about the finality of death and the boundaries that separate the living from the executed. To fully understand the extraordinary and disturbing events that followed Thomas Whitmore's execution, we need to dive into the context of Eastern State Penitentiary during the final decade of the 19th century. The institution, built in 1829, had been designed according to the revolutionary principles of solitary confinement and moral rehabilitation that were intended to transform criminal behavior through isolation and contemplation. By 1891, however, Eastern State had evolved into something far different from its founder's idealistic vision. The prison housed over 1,700 inmates in conditions that were overcrowded, brutal, and increasingly focused on punishment rather than rehabilitation. The death penalty was carried out with mechanical efficiency in a small chamber specifically constructed for hangings, witnessed only by the required officials and recorded in the prison's meticulous administrative records. Thomas Whitmore had been convicted of the murder of Margaret Ashford, a young seamstress found strangled in her Philadelphia boarding house room during the winter of 1890. The evidence against him was circumstantial but compelling. He had been seen arguing with Margaret outside her residence the evening of her death. His landlord reported that he had returned to his own room with blood on his clothing, and a witness claimed to have seen him disposing of what appeared to be women's jewelry in the Delaware River. But there were aspects of Whitmore's case that had troubled those involved in his prosecution and subsequent imprisonment. Throughout his trial, he had maintained not only his innocence, but his complete lack of memory regarding the events surrounding Margaret Ashford's death. Medical experts who examined him found no evidence of the mental deficiencies that might explain such memory loss. Yet Whitmore's confusion about the crime appeared genuine rather than calculated. Even more unsettling was Whitmore's behavior during his 15 months on death row. Unlike most condemned prisoners, who either raged against their fate or sank into despair, Whitmore maintained an eerie calm that seemed to suggest he was waiting for something rather than simply accepting his approaching execution. "The prisoner displays no fear of death," wrote Dr. Samuel Morrison, the prison's chief medical officer, in his evaluation reports. Indeed, he seems to regard his execution not as an ending, but as some form of transition to a different state of existence. When questioned about his apparent serenity, he responds with statements that suggest he believes death will not be final for him. The routine prison portrait that would become central to the mystery surrounding Thomas Whitmore was taken on December 10th, 1891, exactly 5 days before his scheduled execution. The photograph was part of Eastern State's standard documentation process, designed to create a permanent record of each inmate's appearance for administrative and identification purposes. Mr. Augustus Hartwell, the prison's staff photographer, had taken thousands of such portraits during his tenure at Eastern State. The process was standardized and efficient. Inmates were positioned in the same chair, photographed from the same angle, using identical lighting and camera settings. The resulting images were uniformly clear, properly exposed documentation that served their administrative purpose without artistic pretension. But when Hartwell developed Thomas Whitmore's portrait in the prison's darkroom, he immediately noticed that something about the image was different from the routine mugshots he produced daily. The photograph showed technical anomalies that Hartwell could not explain despite his years of experience with the equipment and processes involved. The negative shows unusual density variations that don't correspond to normal exposure patterns, Hartwell noted in his photographic log. The subject appears clearly defined, but there are shadow effects around his figure that suggest multiple light sources, though only standard prison lighting was used during the session. Even more troubling to Hartwell was his growing realization that Whitmore's portrait seemed to change subtly, depending on viewing conditions and the observer's position relative to the image. Sometimes the prisoner appeared to be looking directly at the camera, while at other angles his gaze seemed to be focused on something beyond the photographer's position. The portrait was filed with Whitmore's other prison records and would have remained an administrative curiosity if not for the events that occurred following the prisoner's execution on December 15, 1891. The hanging itself was conducted according to Eastern states' established protocols. Thomas Whitmore was led to the execution chamber at precisely 6:00 a.m., accompanied by the prison chaplain, Warden Harrison Blackwood, Dr. Morrison, and the required witnesses. The prisoner showed no signs of distress or resistance, maintaining the same calm demeanor that had characterized his behavior throughout his imprisonment. When asked if he had any final words, Whitmore's response was both brief and disturbing. "Death is not the end for those who understand its true nature. You will see me again when the boundaries between worlds grow thin." The execution proceeded without complications. Whitmore was pronounced dead at 6:17 a.m. by Dr. Morrison, who noted in his official report that the prisoner had died quickly and apparently without suffering. The body was removed for burial in the prison cemetery, as was standard procedure for executed inmates who were not claimed by family members. It was 3 days after the execution that the first reports began to surface of something unprecedented occurring within the prison walls. Guards working the night shift reported seeing a figure walking through the corridors that bore a striking resemblance to Thomas Whitmore. But this was initially dismissed as the kind of hallucination or false recognition that could affect men working in the stressful environment of a maximum security prison. But the reports continued and became more specific. Multiple guards, working different shifts and in different sections of the prison, described encounters with a man who matched Whitmore's physical description exactly. His height, build, facial features, and even the clothes he had worn during his final weeks of imprisonment. Guard Captain William Ashford, no relation to the murder victim, was the first prison official to take these reports seriously enough to conduct a formal investigation. His interviews with the affected guards revealed a consistency in their descriptions that was difficult to dismiss as collective imagination or suggestion. The figure appears most frequently during the early morning hours, between 3:00 and 6:00 a.m., Captain Ashford documented in his report to Warden Blackwood. Guards describe him as solid and clearly visible, not translucent or ghostly as one might expect from supernatural manifestations. He moves through the prison as if familiar with its layout, but shows no interest in attempting to leave or in interacting with living personnel. Even more disturbing were reports that the figure seemed to be revisiting locations within the prison that had been significant during Whitmore's incarceration, his former cell, the areas where he had taken his daily exercise, and most frequently, the small room where his final portrait had been photographed. Warden Blackwood, a practical man who had managed Eastern State for over a decade, was initially skeptical about the supernatural interpretations that some staff members were placing on these sightings. His first assumption was that the reports were the result of stress, suggestion, or possibly a cruel hoax being perpetrated by someone with access to the prison. To test this theory, Warden Blackwood arranged for additional security measures and began requiring guards to work in pairs during the night shifts when the sightings most commonly occurred. But these precautions only served to increase the number of witnesses to the unexplained phenomena. On the night of December 28, 1891, exactly 13 days after Whitmore's execution, guards Patrick O'Brien and Michael Sullivan reported an encounter that would transform the prison administration's attitude toward the increasingly disturbing reports. The two men were conducting their regular patrol of cell block D when they observed a figure standing motionless in front of the cell that had been Thomas Whitmore's home for the final months of his life. The figure was clearly visible in the gaslight that illuminated the corridor, and both guards immediately recognized him as the executed prisoner. He was standing exactly as he had during the daily prison accounts, Guard O'Brien reported. Same posture, same expression, same everything. But when we approached, he turned to look at us, and his eyes. O'Brien's report trailed off at this point, with a notation that he had become too distressed to continue the interview. Guard Sullivan was able to provide more details about the encounter, though his account was no less disturbing than his partner's incomplete testimony. The prisoner looked at us like he recognized us, like he was expecting to see us there, Sullivan reported. He nodded, the way he used to during cell inspections when he was alive. Then he walked away down the corridor, moving at normal speed, making normal footstep sounds on the stone floor. We followed him, but when he reached the end of the corridor, he simply wasn't there anymore. The guard's account was corroborated by other personnel who had heard the footsteps and voices from adjacent areas of the prison. Multiple witnesses confirmed that sounds consistent with a normal conversation between guards and an inmate had been audible from cell block D during the time O'Brien and Sullivan reported their encounter. Warden Blackwood's investigation of the incident led him to examine Thomas Whitmore's former cell more closely than had been done since the execution. What he discovered there would convince him that Eastern State was confronting phenomena that went far beyond the normal range of prison management challenges. The cell showed signs of recent occupancy that could not be explained by normal prison operations. The bed had been arranged in the precise manner that Whitmore had maintained during his imprisonment, despite the fact that the cell had been thoroughly cleaned and left empty following his execution. Personal items that should not have been present were arranged on the small shelf exactly as Whitmore had kept them during his final weeks. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of what appeared to be fresh writing on the cell wall, words scratched into the stone with some form of sharp implement, despite the fact that the cell had been searched thoroughly when Whitmore was removed for execution. The message, carved in Whitmore's distinctive handwriting, read, "The portrait preserves more than appearance. Death changes the body, but not the essence captured in silver and light. I remain, as I was documented, waiting for understanding." Dr. Morrison, when consulted about the physical evidence found in Whitmore's former cell, could offer no medical or scientific explanation for what appeared to be posthumous activity by an executed prisoner. His examination of the prison's execution records confirmed that Thomas Whitmore had been officially declared dead and properly buried, yet the evidence suggested some form of continued presence within the prison walls. "We are confronting phenomena that exceed the boundaries of conventional medical knowledge," Dr. Morrison reported to Warden Blackwood. "The physical evidence suggests that some aspect of Thomas Whitmore's consciousness or identity has survived his execution and remains active within the prison environment." It was Dr. Morrison who first made the connection between the supernatural manifestations and Thomas Whitmore's prison portrait. During his investigation of the cell block incidents, he had occasion to review the prisoner's file, including the final photograph taken just days before the execution. What he observed when examining the portrait filled him with a horror that would haunt him for the remainder of his career at Eastern State. The photograph no longer showed Thomas Whitmore as he had appeared during the original session with Augustus Hartwell. Instead, the image seemed to shift and change, depending on viewing conditions, sometimes showing Whitmore as he had been in life, but occasionally revealing glimpses of something that appeared to be his post-execution state, still recognizably the same individual, but subtly altered in ways that suggested he was no longer entirely among the living. The portrait appears to be documenting not just Whitmore's appearance at the time it was taken, but his continuing existence in some form that transcends normal death. Dr. Morrison wrote in his confidential report, "The image serves as a window between the world of the executed and our own, allowing observation of someone who should no longer exist, but clearly does." Augustus Hartwell, when informed about Dr. Morrison's observations, examined his own photographic equipment and processes to determine whether some technical error might explain the unusual properties of Whitmore's portrait. What he discovered challenged his understanding of photography as a purely mechanical process of image capture and reproduction. The photographic chemicals used in developing Whitmore's portrait had undergone changes that Hartwell had never encountered in decades of professional work. The silver compounds in the photographic emulsion showed crystalline structures that suggested exposure to forms of energy or influence that had no place in normal photographic processes. The portrait was created using standard techniques and materials, Hartwell reported, but the final image contains properties that exceed anything that conventional photography should be capable of producing. It's as if the process of photographing Thomas Whitmore somehow captured not just his physical appearance, but aspects of his existence that go beyond normal human perception. As 1891 drew to a close, Eastern State Penitentiary found itself confronting a crisis that had no precedent in the history of American corrections. An executed prisoner appeared to be continuing his existence within the prison walls, connected in some incomprehensible way to his final portrait, which served as both evidence of his posthumous presence and a means of observing someone who should have been permanently removed from the world of the living. The routine prison portrait that had been intended as a simple administrative record had become something far more sinister, a supernatural anchor that prevented Thomas Whitmore's complete passage into death and allowed him to maintain a form of existence that challenged everything the prison staff thought they understood about execution, death, and the finality that the justice system was supposed to provide. What had begun as routine documentation was about to evolve into evidence of one of the most disturbing supernatural phenomena ever recorded within an American prison. Proof that some individuals might possess qualities that allow them to survive even the deliberate attempt by the state to end their existence permanently. The new year of 1892 brought to Eastern State Penitentiary a crisis that would challenge not only the prison administration's ability to maintain order, but society's fundamental assumptions about the nature of death, justice, and the finality that execution was supposed to provide. What had begun as isolated reports of ghostly sightings had evolved into systematic documentation of an executed prisoner's continued presence within the institution that had ended his life. Warden Blackwood's investigation into the Thomas Whitmore phenomena expanded throughout January 1892 as he attempted to develop protocols for managing a situation that had no precedent in American corrections literature. His correspondence with prison administrators in other states revealed that while supernatural reports were not unknown in institutional settings, none had encountered anything approaching the consistency and physical evidence that characterized Eastern State's current crisis. The phenomena associated with Whitmore's posthumous presence had become more frequent and more substantial since the beginning of the new year. Guards reported not only visual sightings of the executed prisoner, but physical interactions that suggested he retained the ability to manipulate objects in the material world. Cell doors that had been securely locked would be found standing open in the morning, always in sections of the prison where Whitmore had been housed or had worked during his incarceration. Personal belongings left by guards would be rearranged or moved to different locations, always organized in patterns that reflected Whitmore's obsessively neat habits during his time as a living prisoner. Most disturbing of all were the reports from inmates who claimed to have spoken with Whitmore during the night hours. These conversations, according to the prisoners who reported them, were not brief supernatural encounters, but extended discussions about prison conditions, legal appeals, and the experience of execution itself. Inmate Joseph O'Malley, serving a life sentence for armed robbery, provided the most detailed account of his interactions with the executed prisoner during an interview with Dr. Morrison in February 1892. "He comes to my cell most nights around 3 in the morning, O'Malley reported. "Looks exactly like he did when he was alive, talks the same way, remembers everything about his time here. But there's something different about him now, something that makes you understand he's not really alive anymore, even though he seems to be." When Dr. Morrison asked O'Malley to elaborate on these differences, the inmate's response revealed disturbing insights into Whitmore's post-execution condition. "He doesn't seem to need to breathe, and his skin has this waxy quality like he's been preserved somehow," O'Malley explained. "But the biggest difference is in his eyes. When he was alive, Thomas had the same desperate look we all get in here, like he was hoping for something better. Now his eyes are patient, like he knows something the rest of us don't, like he's waiting for something that's definitely going to happen." The conversations that inmates reported having with Whitmore followed consistent patterns that suggested he retained not only his personality and memories, but specific knowledge about prison operations and the legal system that governed his case. He would discuss details about his trial, his conviction, and his execution with accuracy that indicated complete retention of his experiences up to and including his death. But Whitmore also demonstrated knowledge that he could not have possessed as a living prisoner. He knew about administrative decisions made after his execution, about changes in prison staff, and about events occurring in the outside world that no inmate should have been able to learn. He told me about my own appeal, reported inmate Marcus Sullivan during his interview with Dr. Morrison. New details about legal arguments that my lawyer was planning to make, arguments that hadn't been filed yet when Thomas was executed. When I asked him how he knew these things, he just smiled and said, death had given him access to information that the living couldn't perceive. The prison chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, found himself confronting theological questions that his seminary training had never prepared him to address. Inmates and guards alike were seeking religious guidance about how to understand and respond to the presence of someone who had been executed but continued to exist within the prison walls. The traditional understanding of death as a transition to divine judgment seems inadequate to explain Thomas Whitmore's continued presence, Father O'Brien wrote in his report to the Archdiocese. He appears to exist in some intermediate state that allows him to remain connected to the world of the living while possessing knowledge and abilities that exceed normal human limitations. Father O'Brien's attempts to communicate with Whitmore directly produced encounters that challenged his understanding of death, redemption, and the spiritual dimensions of criminal justice. During a nighttime vigil in the prison chapel, the chaplain reported a conversation with the executed prisoner that lasted over an hour and provided insights into Whitmore's post-execution existence. Thomas explained that his execution had not transported him to whatever realm awaits the dead, but had instead trapped him in a liminal state between life and death, Father O'Brien documented. He described feeling neither fully alive nor properly dead, existing in a condition that allows him to observe both worlds, but belong completely to neither. Even more disturbing was Whitmore's explanation of why he believed his execution had failed to achieve its intended finality. According to his account, the injustice of his conviction, his continued insistence that he was innocent of Margaret Ashford's murder, had created spiritual conditions that prevented his complete passage into death. Thomas claims that dying for a crime he did not commit has anchored his soul to this world until the truth about Margaret Ashford's murder is revealed, Father O'Brien reported. He believes his continued existence serves as evidence that the justice system has made a terrible error, and that he will remain trapped in this intermediate state until his innocence is proven. This explanation for Whitmore's posthumous presence led Warden Blackwood to authorize a review of the evidence in the original murder case, hoping that resolving questions about the prisoner's guilt or innocence might somehow end the supernatural phenomena plaguing Eastern State. Detective Inspector William Hartwell of the Philadelphia Police Department was assigned to conduct the review, examining witness statements, physical evidence, and court records to determine whether there might have been errors in the original investigation that led to Whitmore's conviction and execution. What Inspector Hartwell discovered during his reinvestigation challenged not only the certainty of Whitmore's guilt, but raised disturbing questions about the thoroughness and competence of the original police work. The witness who claimed to have seen Whitmore disposing of jewelry in the Delaware River proved to be a man with a history of mental illness who had made similar claims about other crimes, claims that had been discredited upon investigation. The blood found on Whitmore's clothing, while consistent with human blood, had never been definitively linked to the victim through the limited forensic techniques available in 1890. Most significantly, Inspector Hartwell's review uncovered evidence that had never been presented during Whitmore's trial. Testimony from Margaret Ashford's landlord, indicating that another tenant in the boarding house, a man named Frederick Morrison, had been seen arguing violently with the victim on multiple occasions and had disappeared from Philadelphia immediately after her murder. The evidence against Thomas Whitmore was circumstantial and incomplete, Inspector Hartwell concluded in his report. The original investigation appears to have focused on Whitmore as a suspect due to his presence at the boarding house, but failed to adequately investigate other possible perpetrators who may have had stronger motives and better opportunities to commit the crime. The inspector's findings supported the possibility that an innocent man had been executed for Margaret Ashford's murder, but this discovery did nothing to resolve the supernatural crisis at Eastern State. If anything, the confirmation of a potential wrongful execution seemed to intensify the phenomena associated with Whitmore's continued presence. Augustus Hartwell's ongoing study of the portrait that seemed to serve as Whitmore's anchor to the material world revealed that the image was continuing to change and develop long after the original photographic session. The portrait now showed details and expressions that had not been present when it was first created, suggesting that it was somehow documenting Whitmore's post-execution experiences. The photograph appears to be living, Hartwell reported to Warden Blackwood. It shows Thomas Whitmore not as he was when originally photographed, but as he continues to exist in whatever state he now inhabits. The image serves as a window into his ongoing experience of being neither fully alive nor properly dead. The portrait's evolving nature made it an object of fascination and horror for prison personnel who were required to interact with it during their investigations. Dr. Morrison documented that prolonged observation of the image produced psychological effects in viewers that ranged from unease to genuine terror. Those who study the portrait for extended periods report feeling that they are being watched by the subject, that Thomas Whitmore is as aware of them as they are of his image, Dr. Morrison noted. Several staff members have experienced vivid dreams after viewing the photograph, dreams in which Whitmore appears to provide information about his current condition and his continuing connection to Eastern State. The prison's administrative crisis deepened when news of the supernatural phenomena began to spread beyond the institution's walls. Newspaper reporters, attracted by rumors of ghostly activity at one of America's most famous prisons, began investigating the story despite official attempts to maintain confidentiality. The Philadelphia Inquirer published the first detailed account of the Whitmore haunting in March 1892, creating a sensation that attracted national attention and brought unwanted scrutiny to Eastern State's operations. The article, while sensationalized, contained enough accurate information to suggest that the reporter had access to inside sources within the prison administration. "Executed prisoner returns from the dead," read the headline, followed by an account that, while dramatized, captured the essential facts about Whitmore's continued presence at Eastern State and the supernatural phenomena associated with his posthumous existence. The public attention created pressure on state officials to investigate the situation and provide explanations that would restore confidence in the prison system's ability to carry out executions effectively. A commission of medical experts, legal scholars, and corrections professionals was appointed to study the Eastern State situation and determine what measures might be necessary to resolve the crisis. Dr. Harrison Blackwood of Harvard Medical School, leading the commission's investigation, arrived at Eastern State in April 1892 with advanced scientific equipment designed to detect and measure paranormal phenomena. His team included photographers using the latest technical innovations, medical specialists with experience in unusual neurological conditions, and researchers who had studied similar cases in European institutions. The Commission's investigation confirmed the reality of the supernatural phenomena that prison staff had been reporting for months. Using sensitive recording equipment, they documented sounds, temperature fluctuations, and electromagnetic disturbances that occurred in correlation with reported sightings of Thomas Whitmore. "We have recorded measurable physical effects that correspond to the presence described by prison personnel," Dr. Blackwood reported. "Whatever is occurring at Eastern State involves genuine interactions between some form of conscious entity and the material environment of the prison." But the Commission's most significant finding related to the portrait that seemed to serve as the focal point for Whitmore's continued existence. Advanced photographic analysis revealed that the image contained properties that defied conventional understanding of how photographs function as static records of past events. The portrait appears to be documenting ongoing experiences rather than serving as a historical record, the Commission concluded. Thomas Whitmore's image changes over time in ways that suggest the photograph is somehow connected to his continuing consciousness and serves as a means of observing his post-execution state. The Commission's recommendations for resolving the crisis reflected the unprecedented nature of what they were confronting. Traditional approaches to supernatural manifestations, religious exorcism, destruction of associated objects, relocation of affected personnel seemed inadequate for addressing a situation that involved clear evidence of an executed prisoner's continued existence. Instead, the Commission proposed what amounted to official recognition of Whitmore's posthumous presence and the development of protocols for managing his ongoing existence within the prison system. They suggested that Eastern State might need to function indefinitely as a facility housing both living prisoners and at least one individual whose execution had failed to achieve its intended finality. But this proposed solution was rejected by state authorities who could not accept the implications of officially acknowledging that the death penalty had failed to work as intended. The political and legal consequences of admitting that an executed prisoner continued to exist would undermine public confidence in the entire criminal justice system. Instead, Eastern State was ordered to implement measures designed to eliminate the supernatural phenomena through what officials euphemistically termed environmental modifications. The portrait that seemed to anchor Whitmore's presence was to be destroyed. His former cell was to be sealed permanently, and any staff members who reported continued encounters with the executed prisoner were to be transferred to other institutions. The implementation of these measures in May 1892 led to the final and most disturbing phase of the Thomas Whitmore crisis. The attempt to destroy his portrait triggered supernatural manifestations that exceeded anything previously documented at Eastern State. When Augustus Hartwell was ordered to burn the photographic negative and all prints of Whitmore's prison portrait, the execution of this directive was accompanied by phenomena that convinced everyone present that they were confronting forces beyond human control. The photographic materials proved resistant to normal destruction methods. Fire would not consume them, acid would not dissolve them, and physical attempts to tear or shred the images resulted in wounds appearing on the hands of those who made the attempts, wounds that matched exactly the injuries that would have been caused by handling the sharp tools that had strangled Margaret Ashford. When the portrait was finally destroyed through the use of industrial furnaces, normally reserved for cremating biological waste, the process was accompanied by sounds that witnesses described as human screaming, despite the fact that no living person was being harmed. Thomas Whitmore appeared to prison personnel for the final time on the night the portrait was destroyed, manifesting simultaneously to dozens of guards and inmates throughout Eastern State. But this final appearance was different from his previous manifestations. Instead of the calm, patient figure they had grown accustomed to seeing, Whitmore appeared in a state of anguish and rage that terrified even the most hardened prison personnel. "He was everywhere at once," reported Guard Captain Ashford. "Every corridor, every cell block, every administrative office. All the witnesses saw him at the same time, but he looked different, desperate, angry, like someone who was being torn away from everything that connected him to existence." Whitmore's final words, heard by multiple witnesses throughout the prison, carried a warning that would prove prophetic. "You destroy what anchors me here, but you do not send me to rest. You only release me to wander, to seek justice wherever the guilty may hide. The truth about Margaret Ashford's murder will be revealed, no matter how many years it takes." With those words, Thomas Whitmore vanished from Eastern State Penitentiary forever, but his disappearance from the prison did not mark the end of his posthumous quest for vindication. In the months and years that followed, similar supernatural manifestations began occurring at locations throughout Philadelphia, associated with his original trial and conviction. Witnesses from his case, police officers involved in the investigation, and even the judge who had sentenced him to death reported encounters with a figure they recognized as the executed prisoner. Frederick Morrison, the boarding house tenant who had disappeared after Margaret Ashford's murder, was found dead in a Chicago hotel room in 1893, his body showing signs of strangulation identical to those found on Margaret Ashford. A confession letter found among his belongings admitted to killing the young seamstress during a robbery attempt, confirming Thomas Whitmore's innocence of the crime for which he had been executed. But Morrison's confession and death came too late to provide justice for Thomas Whitmore, who had already paid the ultimate price for a crime he had not committed. The wrongful execution had created spiritual conditions that trapped an innocent man in a form of existence that was neither life nor proper death, condemning him to wander indefinitely in search of the vindication that the legal system had denied him. Today, more than 130 years after Thomas Whitmore's execution, his story serves as a reminder that some injustices create consequences that transcend the boundaries of mortal existence. The routine prison portrait that was supposed to document a condemned man became evidence that death itself is not always final, especially when that death results from fundamental failures of the justice system. Eastern State Penitentiary, now a museum, still houses the room where Whitmore's final portrait was taken. Visitors occasionally report seeing a figure in the space, standing patiently, as if waiting for a photographer who will never arrive to take the picture that might finally allow him to rest. The portrait that looked routine until the inmate was seen again after his execution serves as a permanent reminder that photographs can preserve more than mere appearance. They can capture the essence of injustice itself, creating anchors that prevent wrongfully executed souls from finding the peace that death should provide. Thomas Whitmore achieved a form of immortality through his execution, but it was an immortality of suffering rather than redemption. Proof that some forms of justice are so fundamentally flawed that they create problems that persist long after all the participants in the original injustice have themselves passed into whatever realm awaits the truly dead.